Welcome back to Pivot 2023 and the panel discussion portion of our session on solid ground addressing induced seismicity challenges. We're thrilled to have heard from 3 technical presenters earlier, and we're now joined by 4 subject matter experts in the fields of geothermal and oil and gas induced seismicity, communications, and other fields. We're aiming to cover a range of topics today, and please also note that the audience can submit questions to the box on the platform at the bottom, and we'll aim to get to those later in the session today. We only have 40 minutes, so I'd love to dive right in and start by asking each of our panelists to give a short introduction of themselves and to provide some context for the perspective from which they're addressing this topic. So let's go ahead and start with Wendy, please.
Hi, thanks, Katie, and thanks for having me here. My name is Wendy Bohon, and I'm an earthquake geologist and a science communications specialist. I actually came into earthquakes in a strange way. I felt an earthquake in LA, went and volunteered at the USGS, completely changed careers from professional acting, went back to school, got a master's degree and a PhD in earthquake geology. I focus on continental strike slip fault systems and how we can look at them using ranges of geothermal techniques and different kinds of dating methods, including remote sensing, things like that. But I'm here today as a communication specialist because I decided after I graduated that I really wanted to go into communications, specifically around rapid onset geohazards like earthquakes. So that's what I do now, and I am here to offer that communications perspective around induced earthquakes.
Excellent. Thanks, Wendy. That will be a much needed perspective today. Let's go to Ola, please.
Hi, my name is Ola Kaven. I'm a research geophysicist with the USGS Earthquake Science Center. At the Earthquake Science Center, I lead the efforts in induced seismicity in geothermal resources, and I've spent the last 10 to 15 years worrying about deformation, seismicity, and seismic hazard assessments in geothermal settings.
Thanks, Ola. Annemarie, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. So I'm Annemarie Muntendam-Bos. I'm actually a specialist at the State Supervision of Mines in the Netherlands, which is basically the safety authority for oil subsurface activities that we have. That includes salt mining, but also oil and gas and geothermal. I'm also an associate professor at the Technical University of Delft. So I kind of have 2 roles. Where I do most of my research on geothermal related induced seismicity. Last decades, I've been mostly involved with the problems in the Groningen gas field, doing a lot of research on the induced seismicity problem there, and also from the regulator point of view, advising the ministry on how to deal with the induced seismicity problem and what we could expect there. What I bring to the table is basically a joint view from a scientist perspective, but also from a regulator perspective. And I'm not the regulator that makes the policies, but actually the regulator that tries to keep everybody safe. So I very much look at that side and look how to manage induced seismicity and how we can keep subsurface activities as safe as possible.
Perfect. Thank you. And thanks for joining us so late from Europe. Jonathan, let's go to you.
Yeah, my name's Jonathan Winsor. I'm currently a carbon capture storage seismicity advisor for Shell. My path to getting here is first as a technical geophysicist around microseismic QC analysis and interpretation. Then I became an asset geophysicist supporting the Montney play here in Canada, in Alberta. And so from there, interpreting the microseismic data and hydraulic fracturing, the issues around induced seismicity also became apparent in the Montney as well as the Duvernay here in Alberta. So that got me into the induced seismicity space and plugging into all the great work that was happening in consortiums in Canada and the US around large wastewater disposal largely, and the induced seismicity associated with that. So then, had a 4-year posting overseas after that, and then returned here again in this current role. So what I feel like I bring to this discussion will be kind of an industry perspective on managing induced seismicity, and I guess kind of an operator lens as well. Where Shell is often in the operator position in many of our production, injection, and hydraulic fracturing scenarios. So hopefully I can bring that lens.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for being here. So in the technical presentation portion of this session, we put out an audience poll asking, how do you feel about induced seismicity risk in the geothermal context? And if we can, I'd love to see if production can put the responses to that poll up now. If not, I can voice them over. So the question we asked was, how do you feel about induced seismicity risk in the geothermal context? And the results showed that 30% of people said it's a significant concern that could be an obstacle to the development of geothermal. 60% said it's a legitimate concern, but solvable with proper care and planning. And 10% said it's not a significant concern at all. So panelists, firstly, I'd love to hear your reaction to that poll response. I'd also love to hear what you would have responded or did respond if you did respond. Wendy, as a science communicator, let's start with you. What's your reaction to the results and how would you have answered this poll?
Well, I was one of the 60% that said that it is a concern, but it's something that we can work towards, we can mitigate, we can try and make it safer. And so, it's interesting to think about it from a communication perspective, because induced seismicity does have real risks and we need to communicate those. We need to be transparent about those, but the way that we do it has to be very audience focused. And so we have to make sure that we are framing it properly, that we are giving people the transparency they need to build the trust that they have to have in order to believe us and work with us as partners. But we also have to make sure not to give information overload. So there's a lot of nuance that has to go into communication around this topic. And fortunately, there's a lot of research that's been done by both geoscientists and the social science community. So we have a very solid base to build on. So I think we're in a good position. We just have to be proactive.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Annemarie, what about from the European perspective? Did the results of this poll surprise you, or is it in line with what you would think yourself?
No, it's actually in line with what I would think. I would be in the 60% as well. I think it is a risk, but we can probably very well manage it. But I do think that there's difference in context. And I think especially in Europe, the societal context and your social license to operate is much more at risk than in America. There is, people look at the risk differently. They're not used to induced seismicity or to any seismicity here very much. It occurs very rarely, and then definitely not the size of earthquakes that you're used to in the United States. So it's much quicker concern of the people than it is maybe on your side of the big ocean. So I think that's the context that we should keep in mind, and that will definitely influence how these polls turns out. So I would not be surprised if only 30% that think it's a very major risk. A lot of Europeans would have answered that, because I think that's more of afraid. Well, people are more afraid of that here than I think when you're used to seismics.
Interesting. Thanks for that perspective. And Ola and Jonathan, from both of you, do you think the audience has an accurate perception of the risk of induced seismicity based on the results of that poll? Ola, to you first.
Well, I would have been in the 30% that it's actually quite a significant risk. And I think the case histories tell us that that is the case. Basel was an issue, of course. And again, I think we need to make the distinction between the hazard, which is something I worry about, how much ground shaking can we produce, and then the risk, what's the societal impact. In Basel, it didn't take a huge earthquake by at least Western US standards to shut down, a very promising project and really put EGS on hold for quite a bit. But Bohon is another one. Bohon, South Korea, with a 5.4 earthquake that I believe caused a fatality. So it's a very legitimate risk. So I would have been maybe in the more pessimistic realm, but I am optimistic in the way that we can use what we've learned from these various sites so far and apply it to new sites. And that will have to include communication beforehand, making sure the community is aware of what the issues are, what the issues could be, site characterization, understanding what type of magnitude earthquake, what size fault is there, and then having proper mitigation strategies in place prior and communicating those throughout. So I guess I'm sort of fall between the two categories. I think it's a significant risk and certainly a significant hazard, but I'm hopeful that there will be better mitigation strategies at future EGS projects.
Thanks. And Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah, I think I'd fall in this similar camp as Ola. I do think it's a significant risk, but there will be cases where it can work, and it can be managed. I think an important perspective is that that doesn't mean that with enough effort every single project will be successful, right? There will be some places where just simply the risks might be very challenging to manage, whereas in other cases you might have quite a few things leaning favorably for you in that scenario. So I think from an industry perspective, I would say, it's manageable from an industry perspective, but on a project by project basis, you'd have to look at it through that lens, and there'll be some projects that obviously are going to struggle with this.
Spend just a few minutes talking about something that we heard repeatedly in technical talks about learnings from oil and gas induced seismicity. And so I just want to spend a few minutes on this. And Jonathan, I'll go right back to you. What do you think are some of the most valuable things to have come out of oil and gas induced seismicity, either the experience of it industry-wide or specific research findings that might be applicable in the geothermal context?
Yeah, some of the earlier talks really highlighted, some of the great work that's happening in universities in this space, and of course, a lot of these universities' work are often sponsored through industry and others in consortiums, and so that's really where I feel like industry has been of value in not just its own internal learning, but in supporting the broader knowledge growth, through academia and through working with others as well. And some of the great things that I think have come out of that is, the importance of, identifying, the critically stressed faults, but a recognition of how challenging that can be. So often where, if you look at examples within the central US where, it wasn't until the faults started lighting up that we could see that they're there. So I think that was quite a learning there, that, to be a bit humble around the limitations of 3D seismic data, and to be open to the fact that we're not going to identify everything in advance. Work continues for me. I'm really impressed in the space of pushing the capabilities when it comes to event detection through machine learning algorithms and template matching, kind of more sophisticated technologies to detect lower magnitude seismicity, because I often feel as though you really need to detect the lower levels before it becomes a potential public concern, right? So being able to detect at lower levels and at greater positional accuracy are things that have really been advanced by industry, but also by academia as well. Improvements in event locations, double differencing, these sorts of things have helped us resolve, fault details to identify the complexity within the seismicity clusters. As well as, I think, advancements in understanding, the larger scale response of the system. So, for example, in Oklahoma, where, with the change or the reduction of basal fluid injection, the seismicity rates decayed in suit, and that was by and large forecasted, by some of the work that some people had done. So I really think we're starting to get our arms around the problem a bit in that space. There are many avenues that still need advancing, but there's been real solid progress in my view.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thanks. Ola, I'd like to go to you on this, because clearly these systems are not exact parallels. So do you have any insights into when we might exercise caution in applying oil and gas findings to geothermal, or what might the limitations be of using oil and gas induced seismicity as an analog in geothermal?
Yeah, I think there certainly is a lot to learn from Oklahoma, southern Kansas type of induced seismicity. The geologic settings of at least a conventional geothermal resource is quite a bit different. It's generally not a sedimentary package on top of crystalline basement. If we think about some of the Western US well-developed fields like the geysers or COSO, these are often magmatic sources of heat with a very shallow brittle ductile transition. So, and then faults basically from the surface nearly to the brittle ductile transitions. The benefit of that is, of course, that your faults aren't as big and you generally know where they are, which is, the complete opposite to what we've experienced in Oklahoma, Texas, and southern Kansas, where we only knew where they were once you started seeing seismicity on them. I think the learnings, though, for other sites, like for example, Salton Sea, which is a deep sedimentary basin that's fairly hot and well developed, there certainly is a lot more transfer there. I think in EGS applications, where it's maybe not that sort of Goldilocks situation of a conventional geothermal reservoir that can happen in deeper sediments close to the basement, where we might not have much of an understanding of the basement fault structures. I think it's there's a lot of transfer of knowledge and experience that can happen in those settings. And of course, that's going to have to play a role if geothermal is to become a major portion of baseload electricity generation. So I think for EGS applications specifically, with engineering that goes into it, with drilling horizontal wells and maybe a little bit more difficult environments due to rock type, certainly temperature, there's going to be a lot of transfer of knowledge from oil and gas for those applications.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thanks. Annemarie, I want to pivot to you on this because I'm wondering from your experience in the Netherlands, Groningen gas field, for example, are there things that have been useful in geothermal induced seismicity research that have come from oil and gas?
Well, I think for sure there's been an awful lot of research here on Groningen the last couple of years, and I think it's really state of the art, but also on models that are highly applicable also to geothermal, like a very detailed site response and ground motion model that has been developed for Groningen. I really think that's state of the art, so I think that's really worthwhile for others to take an example of. But I think what's really important is that there's some other lessons that we can learn from Groningen, which I think are important also for geothermal. And one of them is that you don't overstate your confidence. It's like for Groningen, it was always said that we would never get seismicity in the first place. And then after 30 years, we had our first magnitude 2 events. And then they said, well, it's never going to be bigger than 3. And it just kept increasing. And eventually a 3.6 triggered a lot of research, and finally, they came to the conclusion that, it's not all that certain that it will not become larger, and maybe we have a serious risk problem. And ultimately, it led, of course, to the closure of the Groningen gas field this year. We leave 800 billion cubic meters of gas in the ground, which is easily retrievable, but it's just because the risk is too large, and there's just no social license to get it out anymore. So I think being honest about your uncertainties, not stating like magnitudes will not exceed a certain level, but being honest that you don't know exactly, but you have like bandwidth, and trying to learn how to communicate that. And that, of course, is more Wendy's cup of tea than mine, but I've learned a lot over the last couple of years on what not to do, at least. Let's put it that way. So I learned a lot from what goes wrong. And I hear people also in geothermal sometimes state it's like in porous media, we will never have in seismicity. And I'm like, well, we've only been doing it for like 15 to 20 years now. Groningen didn't start until 30 years afterwards, so I'm not that confident. Let's be careful here. So I think that's very important lessons to take away from Groningen.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that really tees us up nicely for hearing Wendy's thoughts on this. Wendy, let's think not just about applications of technical learnings, but in the communication realm. Things that have been observed from the oil and gas world maybe have been done well or not been done particularly well. And how can we frame hazard and risk differently in geothermal?
Yeah, Annemarie, you set that up really nicely. Thank you for that, because I do think that there was a lot that we could learn from what happened in your case, and also, starting in 2009 in the United States, and how particularly the media narrative got away from people. And once the media had control of the narrative, it was very difficult to rein that back in. And so I think one of the big takeaways from that is that as we expand geothermal, as we take it to scale and go into places where seismicity isn't something they thought about, induced earthquakes isn't something that's on their mind, we have the opportunity to be proactive and really frame the whole situation. And so we can set up appropriately the cost-benefit analysis. What are the actual benefits of having this? And yes, there are risks, and we need to be transparent about that. That's key. Transparency, building trust with communities, having that two-way conversation with people instead of just a top-down information dump. Like, I think we've taken those lessons. They were in many cases difficult lessons from the past and induced seismicity. And we can take that forward and take a more proactive stance so that we can communicate the risks and also communicate the potential benefits, because those are really, really significant.
Thanks, Wendy. I wouldn't normally jump to an audience question already, but we have one that's really in this vein, so I'm just going to do it. And I'm going to go right back to you and then open it up to the rest of the panel. The question is there a right way to talk about induced seismicity as the lesser of two evils when comparing it against the effects of climate change that we are seeing? So Wendy, to you on this, and then let's open it up to everyone else.
Yes, there is a wrong way more than there is a right way. So the right way depends on who you're talking to. Your audience they really have to be the first consideration. And there's lots of things that we need to consider. There's a lot of nuance. One of the things is explaining to people in the right way, right? So we want to set it up as a positive if we can. And then we have to talk about the risk, and we have to be clear about our confidence about what could happen. And it can be helpful sometimes to frame it in terms of the risks we already take, right? So we all perhaps take Advil or ibuprofen, and if you've ever seen the commercials, you know, there's those long lists of things that can happen, the side effects, and yet we have a headache and we still take it. And so getting people to think about the risk they take in their daily lives, and then, you know, correlate that to the risk of climate change and what's happening in the world right now, and how we can start to mitigate those risks in ways that are relatively safe. Are there risks? Yes. So making sure that you're setting it up in ways that people can understand and relate to, and really taking the time to hear their concerns, because that's what leads to trust and respect. And we have to have trust and respect with the communities that we're working with. So doing active listening, making sure that you are actually addressing their concerns and not brushing them off, that can really take us a long way when we're talking about the potential risks that we're facing, you know, in this space to help address some of these climate change issues.
Thanks. Any other thoughts from our panelists on that?
Yeah, if I can, I just want to quickly comment on what Wendy says. I completely agree with you about the engagement with the stakeholders and things like that. The only problem with your example is that, at least that's what we hear a lot in Groningen, is like, yes, that's the risk I get to choose to take. And in this case, it's an operation. It's like a plant, and I don't have any control over it, and it's destroying my property. And we don't accept a certain risk from plants or from chemical industry. And now you're expecting me to take it or just undergo it when you know it's still an industrial operation. And I think that's where a lot of difficulty in the communication, at least in Groningen, came from. It's like it's being imposed on me. It's not a free choice, because I heard a lot of risk policy makers say the same thing. It's like, no, it's, you know, compare it to the risk that you take every day in traffic. It's one I heard said is that it's safer to you choose to let your kid play on the sidewalk, and that's more dangerous than these earthquakes. And it's like, yes, you're right, but it's the difference between having the free choice to take the risk and get in my car or let my child play on the sidewalk, compared to I have no control over it at all, and it's just being imposed on me.
This up, because there's a whole field of literature about this. It's voluntary versus involuntary risk. And we're far more likely to feel good about voluntary risk as opposed to involuntary risk, because we have agency in that choice. And so the way to counter that, and there's a whole bunch of information on framing, particularly in the energy sector, and how to frame different things and how it will work and not work. A lot of this work has been done in Switzerland with surveys and things. But one of the ways that you can counter that voluntary versus involuntary problem is that people are willing to feel better about the potential risks if they feel like people like them had a say in that program starting or happening in that place. And the way to get that done in a way that people feel heard and respected is to have those two-way conversations before you begin the project. So I 100% agree with you. You're absolutely right. It's about giving people agency to feel like they had a choice and a say in what's happening to them.
I think I would add to that, it's a difficult, I love this question of having this differential risk analysis of, you know, if you don't do it, you're going to have to run an oil and gas power plant or coal power plant. I think the really difficult part is it's a discrete local issue versus sort of an abstract global issue. And, you know, your personal impact, it might be a little bit different. But I'd like to point out also that this type of outreach and acceptance by the community is actually been going on for quite some time at the Geysers geothermal field in Northern California. That's been in operation since the 1960s. There's quarterly community meetings where updates in seismicity and whatnot are communicated with the public. And they have a very, very capable staff scientist there that leads these discussions. And there is a fund created by the production company that actually reimburses people in case there is cosmetic or structural damages to nearby homes. And I think that has gone a very long way in local acceptance of a geothermal plant and knowing the hazard and the risk associated with it, and really buying into it on a local scale. And I think, again, what Wendy and Annemarie already said, the transparency and the engagement with the community is really key. And it's been a highly successful model at the Geysers.
I think one of the so I fully agree with what's been shared. The early engagement is key, and the continuous engagement throughout is also key, and making sure people stay connected to it and informed. I think, like, if you look at other industries like mining, where blasts and ground motion result from surface effects by detonation of explosives, they came with a level of regularity. And I think that's something that even with the community buying in and maybe supporting, let's just treat that, let's say we've achieved that. I think the experience of seismicity due to fluid injection being somewhat unpredictable as to when it will occur, at what time, you don't know you're going to have the 2 p.m. blast every day. So even if the effect to people is the same physically, I think mentally it's very different things when they don't exactly know when they might feel something. So I think that's something where, although we can draw on the experiences of these other industry activities, something that's a little more complex to control is something that kind of adds an extra layer of complexity to managing the community experience to these sorts of projects. And I think furthermore, even with the best engagement, of course, you're never going to have, it's unlikely to get a unanimous community buy-in, right? So I think in every community, regardless of how successful your efforts are to bring them along and include them and give them agency in the process, you'll always have people who have more concerns than others who I think need to be heard as well and somehow addressed. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. That's a very fruitful discussion. I want to get one more technical topic in before we get to the rest of the audience questions, and we're already flying through our time, so I'm just going to go straight to it. I want to talk a little bit about mechanisms of induced seismicity in the geothermal context. And, Jonathan, you'll be well-versed in the oil and gas operations induced seismicity. We see a variety of mechanisms proposed or played out: fluid extraction, depletion, stress change, fluid injection, pore pressure increase, pore elasticity, specific types of fracking, even in the Eagleford. In geothermal, the questions of mechanism, I would just love to hear our panelists' thoughts on, are they quite well understood, and what are the remaining technical questions that are out there? And Ola, maybe we could start with you on that.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions that still need to be addressed. So I like to sort of break it up into conventional geothermal areas that have a naturally occurring resource, but those often tend to have a lot of naturally occurring seismicity. Now the production that, say, the geysers or COSA have been going on for a long time, it's really difficult to distinguish between which one is tectonically driven, which one isn't. There's some fairly new research coming out of some of the fields in Nevada, is that it's actually the shut-in periods that are causing most of the seismicity, not the actual active production periods. And it's really the movement away from a sort of equilibrium state that exists when you continually produce. So that is an interesting portion where certainly pore elasticity, pore pressure itself play an effect. But on the EGS side, I think it's much more relatable to what folks in oil and gas have experienced. Obviously, the encountering of natural faults in the nearby area is always a major concern. Maybe fracking up a little too high and creating a large fault or fracture is an issue, but there's certainly more room for mitigation and maybe more room for having, at least during the stimulation, some effect on it. I think the technical challenge, or the sort of scientific challenge that is coming into more focus these days, is that a huge portion of the geodetic deformation is actually occurring aseismically, and only a tiny fraction, probably a lot less than 1% of the geodetic moment, is actually expended in seismic energy. And so there's a feedback between aseismic deformation driving faults, maybe to seismicity, and vice versa. And I think that's an emerging field of really interesting research. Arjun, I believe, talked about this some in the technical presentation. There is some of it in Peter's talk as well. And this is going to require quite a bit of different sensing moving forward. So a lot of technical challenges. I'd love to hear what Jonathan has to say about this from the oil and gas perspective.
Yeah, so I think I agree with what you said. I think we need to maintain a great deal of humility still in not overstepping how much we think we know. I think so often we're going to have to learn through practice and operational experience. So there will be a learning curve there, and I think there's so frequently it's going to be actually a combination of multiple mechanisms for a given operation that's contributing to seismicity. As you mentioned, could be proelastic effects, could be aseismic creep, which is causing a stress concentration elsewhere, which then triggers. Could be aftershocks from a seismic event, so that sort of behavior of an aftershock sequence that is contributing. So untangling all these various physical processes contributing to just the observation of a localized seismicity is quite an undertaking. And so I think we need to leave all options open and be open-minded to learn through experience in this space.
Jonathan, I'd be interested to hear from you the types of tools that Ola says, are really needed in geothermal to especially think about aseismic slip versus seismic, for example. How widespread is that technology in the oil and gas field, induced seismicity, and specifically in hydrofrac operations? Thinking of DAS, for example, or other technologies.
Yeah, so there's technologies out there like DAS or InSAR surface deformation measurements. I guess these are probably the most commonly used for aseismic slip, because it's essentially very ultra low frequency deformation that you're trying to detect there, and so that comes with its own challenges, and particularly at reservoir depth, right? So if your operations are occurring, if you're injecting down to say 2-3 kilometers depth, well then the surface deformation effect of that is often quite difficult to unravel. And then even if you can detect it, being able to downward continue that down to the reservoir level to understand what's happening is very challenging as well. So I think in particular, the aseismic space I find to be quite a challenge to I guess to measure and confidently be able to attribute to a physical process. There are other tools available. DAS can go very low frequency as with InSAR, for example. Conventional seismicity tools like geophones, those sorts of things typically won't go low enough to sample the aseismic sort of deformation that we're looking for. So yeah, new tools would always be welcome. But even with advent of new tools, I think being able to, like I said, attribute it to a physical process will still be a remaining challenge.
Thanks. Annemarie, anything you want to add to this from your background in research or regulation?
I guess I also think that there is a bit of a loophole here. It's like a chicken and egg story, which I often tell also people in Groningen. It's like on the one side, to really try to start understanding this, we need data. And today, data basically means you need seismicity. But the one thing we want to prevent is have more seismicity. So it's really a chicken and egg story on where to start. So we're trying to do with the limited data that we have, we try to do as much as possible. We do a lot of lab work, which helps greatly in understanding also these differences between seismic and aseismic slip. You get the rate of state models from that, you get the slip weakening models from that. But we also see that there's differences. It's like Groningen was always thought, okay, we can explain it with slip weakening, but then the lab showed that actually the rock is slip strengthening, so we should not have any earthquakes at all. So what is happening? And so we go all the way back to the drawing board, and even for Groningen, we now are still puzzled about what is actually going on. So we just have to keep on going and do the best that we can. But yeah, there is still a lot of unknowns, and I think the most important bit is, like I said before, it's just to be honest about those all the unknowns, and then try to say that we're doing the best we can.
Thank you. We only have about a minute left, and I would love to just go to each of our panelists. If we're sitting here in a year from now, what progress would you like to have seen us made and be discussing this time next year, either a technical challenge or a communication challenge? And Wendy, let's start with you.
Oh, I'm on the spot and I don't have much time. I think it would be nice if the whole community started thinking about problems around communicating and started working to come up with some best practices.
Love it. Ola, let's go to you.
I think we're very data limited, especially in the third dimension down. So having instruments in boreholes or having access to data from instruments, boreholes, whether it's oil and gas or geothermal, would be really good. And I think the Netherlands is a great example of data transparency, where everything from Groningen is available to the public and researchers and so on.
Perfect. And Annemarie?
Yeah, so for me, I think the most important is, especially with like the climate policies and where we need geothermal, is that we start communicating that we accept those risks because we want to push geothermal. And that's especially one for the policymakers, is don't try to downplay the risks to get your geothermal going, but be honest about it and be honest about the choices you make.
Thanks. And Jonathan, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I would say in the communication space as well. Open dialogue about these issues, facing them as a community of industry, the public, the regulator, academia, having open, honest discussions about the risks and trade-offs of this potential industry would be, I think, have the biggest gains. If a year from now we could have a conversation on this topic.
Perfect. Thanks. I'd love to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Wendy, Annemarie, Ola, and Jonathan, for a great discussion. Looking forward to the next one. We really appreciate your contributions in this important space. Bye.